Well, I guess if this is where the recording starts, we should start with an acknowledgement of the technical insanity that we've been having for the last 20 minutes or so. This is not a simple thing. And yes, Bonnie, you're correct in pointing out that the cost of participation in this conversation is becoming a cyborg. Maybe that's the right place to start.
And Michael, I actually bought a microphone because you told me I had to, an expensive one for me, and then you never even invited me on your damn podcast.
Sir, you are on my podcast right now, first of all. Second of all,
where's your microphone?
Where's your microphone?
Attached to my computer, which your stupid software doesn't work with.
Third. Yeah, I don't know. Riverside's going to hear about this.
It already is.
Jason, I want to point out Jason's been very flexible and has gone with the flow of these past 20 minutes.
Yes.
Yes.
He's a farmer.
We appreciate you, Jason.
Yeah. I mean, and Jeremy, who emailed us at God All this morning and said that he couldn't be here. I think it's just worth acknowledging that he's probably the wisest of us all, because he's avoided entering the machine. He's off writing a book somewhere. Like right now, he's, or hosting a conference. Like he's not doomed to the same folly as I. So thank you all for this.
How did this all get started? I can't even remember.
Yeah, that's a good beginning question.
Jonathan started this, and which is funny because Jonathan's we're gonna back into this conversation with him showing up because he has to take his kids to school. But Jonathan was writing about the meta crisis and liminality, and he shared some excerpts of his stuff on Twitter.
Oh yeah.
And we all started riffing on it. And I'll dig up that link and I'll share it, I guess, with when we share this. But it was the question, I think, was around whether people working in liminal spaces can unionize. Like whether there's a there that we can name, or whether that means that we're basically like stretching a dead bat on a mat at a museum and pinning it to the mat, and then it's like it's not flying around anymore. At what point have you killed the process of sense making by giving it a handle, so that you can carry it around and bring it to the store, put it on the counter, sell it, and say, hey, this is what I do. I am a sense maker for your organization. I work in the liminal. I help you navigate rifts. I provide context. And people are like, oh, cool. I have economic value for you. And then at that point, are you still the guy, the weirdo living on the hut at the edge of the village? Or are you like some Wall Street bro? I have Bitcoin. I mean, I'm a complete contradiction. What do you think?
Two different things going on. There's mapping is really trendy. Everyone's trying to map the liminal web, even though nobody really knows what it is. And so the maps look pretty different. And then Jonathan's trying to create a field. That's what he called it, as a field, because he wants it, I think, to be a bigger player in the larger sense-making of global affairs, I guess. And so giving it some legibility, while, as you say, Michael, not pinning a dead bat, is the perennial question. Is a subculture that's emerging and dynamic and not fully aware of itself, can it become a field? I think that's the question.
I remember now what we were talking about. I think there's like a couple of like principles or that we can kind of suss out of this, and that is, one is when people map out spaces like this, they kind of like go meta on the space. And one of the problems with going meta is that it exits its own domain. So if I go meta on religion, I'm no longer doing religion. And if I go meta on education, I'm no longer doing education. And so people get a sense that they're contributing, but they're really actually contributing in a different domain, right? So if I map out all the ecologies of all the different types of ecology theories there are, I'm not doing ecology, I'm doing meta theory. And so people can get stuck in thinking they're contributing to the domain, but they're actually contributing to a different domain. So that's one important thing. The other thing is that, I just posted something on Twitter today, which is very hard for me to understand because it's from this website Veracitum, and it's talking about math and why math is incomplete, inconsistent, and undecidable. But what the fundamental principle is that at a certain level, when you we take math and then you apply math to it. So a self-referential move, it destroys its functionality. So they talk about Turing. He understood this because his Turing machine had two systems. One, some systems would halt, right? They would have halting programs and some would not halt. And he built the algorithms for that. And then he put the algorithm for that back into his own system. So this notion of self-referentiality. And the thing got into undecidability. It couldn't decide anything. So I think this question of being aware, I'm aware that Jason and Ashley and Michael and Stephanie and Jonathan and Jeremy, I'm aware that there's relationships there that are more than the sum of their parts. But then so that's an awareness, but I think we need to be careful not to be self-referential about it, because then I think it gets kind of stuck.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if there's also a kind of not just whether we do it, but how we do it, because I do think there are ways to hold up a mirror that actually enable us to evolve, right? That like by virtue of seeing ourselves, it's like the social equivalent of biofeedback. It's like by seeing ourselves clearly, we can more creatively and consciously and deliberately like influence our own growth. But I guess I would also just wonder, like, what are we trying to do? I mean, just ultimately, what are we all as individuals or as subgroups or as a liminal web, what are we trying to achieve? Because there are taxonomies for their own sake that's like, oh, look, there are mushrooms that are red and there are mushrooms that are brown. And then there are taxonomies that are really functional. Like these are the mushrooms that know how to bioremediate this kind of thing. And these are the mushrooms so that we can really use a taxonomy in order to do something. In this case, use a mushroom taxonomy to do bioremediation. So yeah, I just wonder like what are we trying to do? And like how can mapping ourselves or taxonomizing ourselves then serve that purpose?
Ashley, do you want to speak? Because I have some thoughts on stitching this, but I want to let you take a turn.
I basically am like very, very new to the liminal web. Like just meeting Jason and like starting Doomer Optimism, he's been like trying to get me up to speed, but like I don't really know much about it. I've been on the Stoa a few times, like basically is the extent of it. And so it might be interesting. I don't know, maybe this is where you were going to go, Michael, but it might be interesting for you all to just riff on like where the state of where you think it's at. And are people like sort of getting fed up? Like it seems to me as an outsider very, very broadly that people are sort of sick of too much talking. Just to put it very plainly, like people are like, okay, cool. The sense making is useful to some degree, but also what is it in service of? Is it in service of us just talking to each other on the internet? And then we have our little group that we all talk to each other and we're all like part of this thing. And we spend a lot of time talking about who's in what group and making taxonomies of people's philosophical points of view. And then for what? I think I'm just wondering if there is this feeling like we're at a sort of breaking point, or you all are at a sort of breaking point where you want to like make a pivot towards something else. And what would that be?
Yeah, well, as someone who was, again, up at Godall last night, removing rebar from an old fence in my yard, assembling patio furniture, and otherwise doing things that I don't get to when the kids are awake. I want to say that all the comments that everybody just made now have me reflecting on, first of all, Bonnie, there are plenty of instances in which math is recursive and works and has to work and works because it's recursive. I mean, Francisco Varela's Calculus for Self-Reference, I think it's like a 1972 or 73 paper where he's basically trying to mathematize consciousness and does so. And chaos theory has a lot of recursive functions in it. And so when you're, nonlinear systems, like you think about people like Doug Hofstadter and I Am a Strange Loop, he's the guy that wrote Gödel, Escher, Bach. So like he's coming from the same place as the guy in Veritasium. I forget his name, but like he's coming from that same study of the understanding of the incompleteness of things and of the curiosity of recursive functions. And it seems that that's what we do as sapient beings. But of course, there is a pathology, right? You got to find that Aristotelian golden mean. And so the pathology is when, and this is well studied in psychological literature, when someone is so self-conscious that they cannot act. Because like, the people that are really depressed tend to be the most self-aware. They tend to be the most critical of themselves. Like the saints are the ones that are like, help me, Father, I am a horrible person. And everyone else is like, what are you talking about? He's like, oh, I did that one thing when I was 5, and they, so there's this extent to it that inhibits doing. And so it's a valid complaint. It's a valid issue. But the problem is that that's what podcasting is. And so like the way that I think about this, it's like, I mean, even if you're like a podcaster on general contracting, right? You're talking about general contracting. It's a different thing from podcasting. You have to be meta inherently in order to talk about things. And so I see the function that each of us are performing in this role, not throughout our entire lives, obviously, because all of us are doing lots of things. But I see the frustration in this space as a sort of lack of understanding of the way that podcasting and podcasters are performing as one tissue, like one cell type in the body of something that is emerging, in the body of something that is growing. And so like the question is the proportion of thought and self-reflection to action. And the question is like, how many of us, I had to block a guy I really like a couple of weeks ago on Facebook because I just didn't have the patience after days with kids and screaming at me and things going on at work to deal with him critiquing this exact thing and sort of like mocking or dismissing the function of podcasting as not doing, as not building or whatever. I mean, the problem is that Yeats put more people in the Irish Revolution with his poetry than anybody did. And William Irwin Thompson was always quick to that, was always pointing out the function of the poets and what people in this sphere or orb would call the sense makers. So, I mean, I think that it's there. It's just a question of, as my friends at work are always asking, have we reached peak podcasting? Like how many more talking heads can this system support? How many at a given time should there be? How many people should be on stage versus listening? And oh, hey, look, we have another talking head. Perfect timing, Jonathan. So
nice.
we're kind of just suggesting that the frustration that people feel with this liminal web stuff and with this whole thing in general seems to be a tension between self-reflection, recursivity, self-awareness, and then doing something about it. And that there's perhaps a balance that we could find from a study of the living world that puts the function of podcasting as one like tissue in the body of an organism. And then it just becomes then a question of how self-aware does this thing need to be in order to accomplish its tasks? And what are those tasks? And at this point, maybe it makes sense to just like pass you the baton and let you run with it for God, however long.
I just want to make some distinctions because I think you said a lot and some of the stuff was kind of conflated. So there's recursivity. So that's not problematic in math or anything else. But then there's what I said was problematic was self-referentiality. So you're outside yourself to reference yourself. You're outside and it's not, I don't think, a coincidence that Goodell became so self-referential and so paranoid about touching anything because he thought it was dirty and he was going to die that he starved himself to death. This is the way his mind worked. That, you know, but what if, you know, always trying to get out.
Incompleteness.
Exactly. So recursivity, I totally agree. We're just talking about self-referentiality. And then the meta move, yeah, when you map the space, if you talk about construction, you're not doing construction. I'm not saying that that's not important. You have to realize that you're contributing in that domain, not the domain you're talking about, and people get confused because they may be contributing something, but they're contributing in a different domain. And then the third one, so recursivity, self-referentiality, meta, and the third one is aware. Yes, we are aware of each other. This, I think, is probably the most rich thing that's happening. But maybe that helped Jonathan get oriented to what we're already talking about.
Bonnie, you never fail to help, and it's good to see you all. It's nice to see that you're not just Twitter icons, and that you probably, based on this evidence, are more than just a face on a screen. So yeah, I'm sorry to miss the first half hour, simply parental duties. But it's lovely to be here. And I guess you've already introduced the sort of premise of the call and the shared experience of kind of excited frustration, maybe. Stephanie, I loved your expression about, what was it, liminal bingo? What was it again? Sorry.
Liminal lingo bingo.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, that had the right kind of playful spirit about it, but obviously the underlying feeling is something altogether more serious. Most of us perceive something, I think, and it's not necessarily the pending apocalypse. You know, Raymond Pascal recently wrote a great piece suggesting that many of us might be described as apocalyptarians, people who are sort of seeing multiple features of the meta crisis co-arise and just sensing into not the ending of the world as such, but the ending of the known world, the world that we've kind of grown up with and come to become familiar with, and sensing that some different way of living is necessary, but being a bit tired of saying that in different ways. New conceptual arms, if you like, don't really seem to be fit for purpose in the wider battle. It seems we have to get a bit beyond yet another paper, yet another podcast. I think all of us are having done that for sort of, I don't know, up to 5 years or so, the last little half decade, I suppose. I think there's a little bit of an action itch in the network, but we're a bit too cool to just act. In other words, what I mean by that is, you know, you can valorize action, right? There's a kind of fetishization of action, like don't just think, act, which is also kind of stupid. So somehow what we're looking for is a discerning way to make sense of our perception of the world as something that is crumbling slowly but surely, possibly inexorably, and yet not really knowing how to create the countervailing motion of creating a new world in a way that A, makes any sense vis-a-vis some of Bonnie's previous comments in terms of the dissonance between our action possibilities and our civilizational sort of mental context, but B, one that actually is sort of rewarding and feels like it's worthwhile. And that means, you know, when I look at Jason's Twitter stream, I think, God, at least the guy's planting something, you know, like at least it's like real and vivid and earthy and tangible. And, you know, I have similar forms of reward in my own life, but it's that kind of feeling of what does it look like to do something that speaks to the diagnosis you've come up with, however elaborately, whether you frame it as meta-crisis, meta-modernism, game B, dark renaissance, doomer optimism, civilizational crisis, multipolar trap. It doesn't really matter. After a certain point, we're all like familiar enough with the lexicon. Okay, now what? So that's how I see this conversation, as a kind of breaking of the ice there, not really having an answer yet, but saying, let's move into that. Let's allow that ice to break, melt, and see where we can swim with the water.
So the way that I've kind of resolved that for myself, and I don't have this totally worked out, so bear with me, but is speech is an act of creation, right? Genesis, and God said, and we are now all the way to GPT-3, where you can literally say something. Are you all familiar with what GPT-3 is? Well, for listeners who are not familiar, we are now at the point where you can describe a film or a photograph or a game or something that you want created digitally, and AI can create it for you. It's wild, and God said, and now we are saying, and it can create. And so I think there is a way in which sometimes, like, we're not yet fully taking responsibility for our co-creation of reality. And so it's like when we talk about the world, we're not just talking about the world, we are shaping the world. Especially, I mean, once you get to high levels of influence, and I'll just give an example. I mean, recently Ezra Klein and Fiona Hill had this conversation, right, about what's going on in Ukraine, and they're talking about Putin, and Ezra's asking her, like, how do you think things are going to end? And she's saying, like, oh, I'm hesitant to talk about different scenarios because then I might lead the world in that direction. It's like, you're already leading the world. It's already happening. So just like take responsibility for where you're leading us. And actually where they led the world in that conversation, I thought was actually very responsible. She's talking about Putin, and she's basically saying, and I almost feel like break the fourth wall and just talk to Putin because he might be listening, but they're actually saying, I mean, the gist of what she said is, we abhor your actions, but we understand where you're coming from. And the US has responsibility. I mean, imagine if they just directed that to him. I mean, they don't necessarily need to do that, don't need to break the fourth wall every time. But the point is, yeah, we are thinking and talking. I wouldn't make such a hard distinction between thinking and speech and action and doing, because we co-evolve with the stories that we tell about ourselves.
So I don't know how much we should defer to the chair here, Michael, but just in response to that, I agree. And yet, I think this is the feeling we all have. It's, on the one hand, we know that words are action, writing is action, thinking is action. And what we come up with to make sense of the predicament and the possibilities inherent in it are meaningful contributions. So there is a world creation going on, and those with the greatest influence have perhaps the greatest responsibility, but all of us have some, and should use it wisely. I suppose I want to just counter that by saying it can give rise to some dissonance, though. There can be feelings of create an enormous effort to, for example, write an essay or write a book even, and then look at the world that we're now perceiving no longer as the local bookshop or even the national conversation, but something about planet Earth in middle of the 20th century, now moving into a different phase of geological time, or already well within it, where it's not clear how much influence we can really exert on the powers that be at scale. Now, we might think we do what we can, and I agree, and one can only do that. But I think part of the frustration and part of the reason we haven't quite coalesced into anything like an action plan is that the gap between the diagnosis and the perception and our sort of embodied action potentials are just very, very different. They're almost incommensurate. Some people manage to find an answer to that, but many don't. And they live with this sense of, is what I'm doing really making any difference whatsoever? And the more optimistic among us and even the more pessimistic on good days have to affirm that and say, yes, that thing I just wrote, that really matters. That Twitter thread that I invested 2 hours in, of course it's important. But another part of us, and I don't know if I speak just for myself here, does wonder, maybe I should have gone to the local homeless shelter and helped out for a couple of hours. It's just not clear. It's just not clear at this moment how best to spend one's time to make a difference.
Can I just say two things just in response? Go ahead, Bonnie.
Well, I want to say something, and unfortunately, where's Ashley? Because I wanted to try to say something that would pivot to Ashley and Jason. I just want to say that I listen to Do Optimism because it stretches my way of inquiring into the work I do here at the farm, and it challenges me to think harder and make different decisions. And people exemplify maybe or model some of that work that I might be better at myself. But the bridge here is that, yes, language and our theories and our presuppositions about the world change the world. And if we have language and then technology can amplify that change, the issue here is that downstream from all conceptualizations of change are real concrete causal implications. So downstream from you talking into a computer and making, let's say, a video that inspires people, you lower the action thresholds for actual concrete work to happen somewhere in the world. And the question is, what is your obligation to what that effect is? Do you mine more lithium because you've created people wanting to go to the stars? Do you market farmers out of the global agricultural economy because you have all this downstream from any kind of saying that we can do speech acts that can change the world are actually concrete world, real world phenomenon. And if you get too far from knowing that, then you absent yourself from the obligations of what happens there. So it's not that easy. Just because technology lowers the action thresholds and scales what you say, what are the actual, at the other end, downstream, there's the earth is being moved, the planet is being changed, people's lives are changing. And I don't know if Jason and Ashley, I kind of wanted to bridge to the other perspective, looking up from the other piece up at technology and decision making.
Jason, I'll let you go first if you want. Is Jason frozen for you all too?
Yeah. I think what he said was so prophetic that it just sort of, turned him to stone or something.
The machine couldn't handle it. I have some thoughts too, maybe when waiting for him to get back. For me, yes, the system is crumbling, and this Morris Berman dual process theory that I often cite, not a well-known scholar, but we hope to have him on the podcast soon. Basically, when civilizations crumble, there's chaos and maybe potential cult behavior that arises out of it. And I imagine one potential role for like the liminal web or the sense-making community is you can have this sort of dialectic between attempts to experiment on the ground, doing action-related things. So like when I say action-related, I mean like, what is your livelihood? How do you have relationships with other people? Like, what kinds of things are you doing with the material world? For me, for example, we're like doing a form of homesteading. But then how are you building community? In what way? Is that healthy? And then it can go back and forth where we're sort of sharing our experimentation, and then the sense-making community can sort of assess what's going on, both as practitioners and people who are assessing. Like, I think there's always been this traditional role of wise, like a wise group of people, philosophers, maybe it's clergy, maybe it's even matchmakers, this kind of like class of people who help to make sense of what other people are doing and guide it in a helpful way. But I think there's no one set of prescriptions. I think the idea is to experiment and then talk about it in a way that's sort of open and reflective, and I think extremely healthy, or could be extremely healthy. So that's part of what we're trying to do with Doomer Optimism, is just, basically what are you doing on the ground, and critically interrogating it from like a loving friendship perspective. We just had Gregory Landua on, who runs this organization called Regen Network, and the whole conversation was somewhat critical, but in like I'm talking about our conversation with Gregory Landua, but in like a loving way. Like, we want you to succeed. We want regeneration via crypto, whatever you're doing to succeed. But we want to be helpful in thinking about the potential pitfalls and what you're trying to pursue, that kind of thing. So like cheerleading, but also not just sort of letting whatever experiment be whatever without like critical interrogation of like a class of people who like are thinking deeply about these things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I can describe my journey a little bit, which might help elucidate my point of view, and perhaps Ashley's as well. Is, so I was part of both, and it was a lot of attempting this kind of sense making, and various things in my life were changing, but I definitely had this itch of like, okay, what are we doing about it, right? Where is all this conversation going? And for me, it's just part of it. It just was a matter of getting grounded, and part of that is kind of embodiment. So it's different kinds of meditation that focuses more on embodiment, and then part of it was, trying to work with some land and develop land over time in a regenerative way, hopefully. and trying to become more resilient. And then, kind of coming across other people with that sensibility, I think a worldview arose that things are crumbling. And one way to think about it is kind of a dual process theory that Ashley cites a lot, Morris Berman, where, what are we doing to actually create new communities, on the ground that can weather the storm in the short term, but in the longer term can actually create a new society.
One of the distinctions that my class made last week was how technology enables you to coordinate many individuals. All these people flying all over the world, all these people talking. But that's different than integrating communities. And we noticed that that distinction is very powerful. So am I creating technologies that coordinate individuals? The problem with that is it tends to gut communities. Or do I have technologies? And this is what I think reminded me of this because I did watch that Greggy Landau, and that's what it seemed like you guys were doing. Here's a community anchored here in Uruguay. Here's a community anchored here. Here's a community anchored here. And your questions were about each other's communities rather than technologies that and I see that most technologies are designed. And granted, we said, that's cool, you can go and you get on a subway in another country and all this stuff, and you get on your cell phone. All this stuff enables massive numbers of individuals to coordinate, but it guts community. So what is a technology that grows and integrates communities, I think is an interesting question.
Can I dip back in here for a second? There's a lot here. I feel like, first of all, that question is really interesting because that's something that I bring up a lot, not only on Future Fossils, but on Complexity podcast, because all of these complex systems researchers at the Santa Fe Institute are thinking about basically the pickle that we're in now as a consequence of economies of scale and as a consequence of the way that market and state have hollowed out what Sam Bowles and Wendy Carlin call the civil society, which is like neighborhoods, church groups, sporting clubs, mutual aid networks, communities of trust rather than communities of convenience, which most, I think, people on this call would argue aren't really even communities at all. They're just like sort of cancerous systems that serve their own purposes of growth. And so there's this question, arguably a village raising a child is doing that, but like still there's this thing where, and I talked about this with Chris Ryan on Future Fossils, who civilized to death. Absolutely somebody you should have on Doomer Optimism if you can get him, because it was a fascinating discussion about the way that his book articulates that what's really going on here, funnily enough, is that farming is to blame in a weird way, that agricultural civilization, in sort of decoupling people from the dependence that people had as foragers, the better we get at constructing our niche, the less we need everything else. And that we become more and more dependent on the institutions within which we're embedded, which are these sort of like eldritch, archontic, they're superstructures or hyperobjects that are causally impacting us from above, in the way, like all of us have a social contract, right? You're born into a country, you didn't choose that country, but now you have to obey its laws. And so there's this sense in which really the advent of human civilization can be marked as this moment in which humans stopped being in control of this process, and our institutions and our systems took over. And now we're trying to figure out how to like wrestle it back from them. And in a weird way, I don't know, there's just an interesting tension between the obviousness of getting back to the land and the fact that it probably looks something completely different. It probably looks more like Australian Aboriginal wildcrafting or something in some people's estimation. But how do you do that with these systems of high technology? So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, I and this is naughty of me to sort of propose this like choose your own adventure here, but Stephanie, I think you might like it. There's this question again to loop back here on the issue of legibility. And we ourselves are not legible. To connect these 2 points, we ourselves are not legible to these massive systems, and that's the problem. James C. Scott Seeing Like a State thing, which I wrote a song about and I got to perform at Meow Wolf last week. It was super dank. But the question of the way that the systems coarse grain us, and so we're seen as sort of water molecules in a fluid rather than as unique singular individuals. And this is the tension that has always existed between art and the economy, because art is out ahead of what can be named. And so the question of like of how much talking should we be doing relative to how much doing we should be doing is, I think, related to this question of do you have to name something before you use it, which is to give the sympathy to the Russians again, this interesting tension between the way that Americans were doing science behind the iron, like on one side of the Iron Curtain, and the way that Russians were doing science on the other side of the Iron Curtain, where American science now seems relatively unwilling to consider the bulk of evidence for something anomalous to its current paradigm if there is no known mechanism for that phenomenon. Whereas Russian science was always more willing to accept the existence of something like telepathy without knowing at all how it came to be. So there's like, the question of, do you need a theory before you're even willing to accept that something exists? And I think that that's sort of the tension that a lot of people feel in this, like people like Jared Lucas, who really want to make the liminal web legible to the economy so that people that are performing what he sees as a very important function can get paid for it. But on the other hand, there's something sort of irreducibly contrary about the fact that people are out performing reconnaissance and describing things like the platypus, that you bring this back to the Royal Society, as Aldous Huxley talks about in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And they thought it was a hoax. They had just gotten spoofed by the Fiji mermaid. And so they actually dissected this platypus specimen to make sure there weren't stitches in it. And so he's saying that that's what psychedelic natural historians need to be doing, is like bringing these objects back. Like Terence McKenna talks about this too, is like tripping as fishing, that you go out into this space and you bring back something that nobody recognizes. And then you talk about it. And so I don't know, there's a temporality to this, that the fact that it's all happening at the same time seems to be the issue, because ultimately these are like points along a diachronic process, not a synchronic sort of smash of us trying to like discover and understand at the same time. So I don't know, that's a lot, but thanks and have at it.
I can relate to the notion that you were at least indirectly alluding to, which is something about perceiving something that can't easily be named and wanting to live in some sense for it and direct your professional life towards it. I think that's something that many of us do share, at least at some tacit level. I mean, one way of I approach that is that Perspectiva, and it's partly in the name, does schmooze and connect with a different number of sort of perspectives on things. And we don't want to get too high on that. We keep some kind of core philosophy underlying our work. But I've noticed just in my own relationships that I encounter people who tend to have sort of one big idea. Like, for example, there are many who believe that this is a moment that will ultimately lead to some kind of Gebzerian shift of consciousness, that somehow it's a period of time where all of this tinkering with political economy and technology is kind of missing the point, that there's some larger vision thing that we need that's based on reconceiving the nature and purpose of the cosmos, that somehow there's a kind of spiritual breakthrough, and that without that, everything else is just kind of, deck chairs on the Titanic kind of thing. There are some who see it that way, that ultimately it's about something like love, or it's something about relating to the divine in a certain way. And that's one perspective. Then I hear others who, you hear the way Daniel Schmachtenberger would talk, or maybe Tristan, and you get this strong technological emphasis that really, unless you're really attending to the power of technology, often with a sort of game theoretic analysis, then you're not going to understand what's coming, nor are you going to be able to prevent it. And then you hear something like Jason and Ashley speaking, and they say, look, we ground our lives in our land and the people around us. We're aware of the global context. We do what we can with what we have where we are, and nothing more can be done. or words to that effect. Forgive me if I paraphrase. And then you have sort of a mystic seer like Bonnie, who sees through it all with some sort of perspicacity and communicates in a way that people feel that what she just said is really important, but then about half an hour later, they can't figure out what exactly it was. Then you go, I don't know, you go on the Jim Rutt show, and he still somehow seems part of this ecosystem, even though he's full of profanities and boomer kind of analysis. So it's a weird set of relationships. And coming back to the premise in Michael's question, there is something odd about the feeling that these different ingredients are somehow pointing somewhere that cannot be named, as if there's a kind of number of ingredients that are slowly cooking a cake, but we have no idea what the recipe is. We have no idea what kind of cake it is even. But there's something about wanting to cluster around all of these different kind of flavors. And we know it's not as simple as putting them together. That's not it. But it's something like whatever is trying to arise and whatever our role in bringing it about, somehow we need to become more fluent in these different ways of seeing the world that are at once political, spiritual, technological, ecological. And that unless we develop that kind of, I don't know, polyphony or multilingual kind of approach to things, we're not going to be moving in the right direction. We're not going to be moving towards the thing that can't be named. That's kind of how I feel. That's one of the reasons why I feel confused half the time. And Bonnie's very kindly pointed out to me that the confusion can be a kind of authority if it's carried in the right way, because many others feel it. They feel the confusion, and if you sort of lead from the confusion authentically, that's better than pretending to know what you're doing, and people can sense you really don't. But yeah, that's a lot. But that's roughly how I hear you, Michael, on that point. That the sort of unnamed pattern that we're all part of is still somehow calling us to make it sound a bit mystical. And we're trying to orient our lives in that direction. And sometimes it seems a little absurd because the different elements are so apparently unrelated to each other. And yet there's so clearly a patterning effect, a clustering effect, some kind of resonance or whatever. And figuring out what that means and what to do about it is kind of what follows.
I have a quick comment related to that. I think for me, the thing that just is so obvious, and maybe other people will eventually come to this, or maybe not, but I think we need more conversation and experience with material reality. I think we can go a little bit insane talking and thinking too much. I mean, it's just like you can just spend every day on LSD, like thinking and communing with the universe, maybe just via your mind. But there is something in the material world that's necessary to interact with and experiment with, like bake the cake, like actually bake it. Right. And you learn something different than thinking about or doing LSD and thinking about what baking a cake would be like. There are a lot of extremely popular classes that are basically, let's think about the crisis and think about the world we might want to live in, as opposed to like your assignment. I mean, I'm teaching this homesteading class. Your assignment today is to plant some potatoes. It's to plant potatoes and see what happens. And then they come back to the class with all sorts of insights about like what happens when you plant potatoes that they wouldn't get if they just think, yeah, more people should plant potatoes kind of thing. And I think if we're talking about things like, connecting with the singularity of like some deity or the universe or something like that, that can also come through connection with the material world and not just necessarily doing LSD. I mean, no offense to LSD, like psychedelics have a role or whatever, but they're just not the only thing. And thinking isn't the only thing.
Can we do LSD and plant potatoes? Because that's kind of my jam.
I've done that. It's great. Purple potatoes.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think that's actually what is, I've actually noticed that like there is a role of psychedelic medicine or thinking or meditating, which are all on this spectrum of like thinking and changing your perspective, changing your neural wiring so that you can relate to the material world in a different way. But I think, yeah, fundamentally, I'm pretty fed up in general with too much of the thinking and talking about thinking.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's kind of like two aspects to what Doomer Optimism is trying to do. I mean, we're definitely trying to ground people in physical reality, but we're also curiously exploring the potentials of technology for connecting people in new and novel ways and coordinating peoples, right? So we've had a few episodes, with people who are interested in Web3, regenerative finance, cosmolocal production, various things that are all kind of techno enabled. And I think we're ourselves are trying to navigate what is this relationship to this larger structure, this larger cake. And, I think in a minimum viable sense, our relationship to it is we're all kind of trying to get in touch with the physical world, but we're connected across the globe, right? So we're creating networks across the globe. A while back on the Stoa, I did a presentation talking about trying to do some mimetic mediation I was talking about the localists, the bioregionalists, the metamodernists, and I call it the decentralists, the Web3 type people. And, my point was that, yes, these are all kind of different ingredients of a cake. One thing that the kind of digital technology can provide is this infrastructure to create this larger consciousness and this larger collective action. And then what I saw metamodernism contributing was this kind of cultural maturity, the cultural theory, but also human maturity, right? Understanding, what kind of people do we need to become to inhabit these new structures that are forming. So I guess I just wanted to add that also a little bit, just an addendum to what you said, Jonathan. We're kind of like slowly inching towards, trying to connect with the liminal web and, inching towards this larger connection, because I recognize that we're all going to need each other in these different ingredients, but we're just, we're starting, okay, plant a potato and then and then tell other people how you did it, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that comes to my mind when you say that is, not to make it too political too quickly, but just that it reminds me of Peterson's injunction to make your bed, actually. Plant your potato and make your bed. They're not quite the same thing, because one is sort of organismic and it taps into ecology and life and so forth. But it's similar to, like, dig where you stand and what is your material reality and what can you do to attend to it properly. And so I suppose the other good thing about that injunction to get real, and I mean, the other thing that comes to mind is the war in Ukraine, just because as part of the Emerge community that I'm involved in, we have a weekly session every Wednesday where we just invite people to come and share their relationship to the unfolding reality, including people in Ukraine that are part of the network. And there's always between about 1 in 5 people from Ukraine who can, make it if they can, of course. And what's interesting about that is the Emerge community was forged with a kind of spiritual ethos of some kind. And I think everyone agrees that if spirituality means anything, it's some kind of contact with reality. It's at its root, whatever your distinctions or your preferences, to become real or be real is part of what it's about. And there's nothing, sadly, more real than war, right? War is reality right in your face, literally. And it's been quite touching to sort of be there with people who are, literally on the computer with us, sort of not quite looking over their shoulder, but not far off. And when we do that, there's always this feeling of wanting to be a bit more like that, to be a bit closer to the front line, whatever that is. Planting a potato might not make you cry, but for me, the things that make you cry are, I sort of always feel they're the ones you ought to move towards, the ones that somehow life is richer and fuller there. And that's kind of whatever it is you do to make that happen, or whatever has to happen to you for that to be allowed to be experienced. I'd like more of that. And I think if the whole community could have a bit more of that, we don't always have to be like crying parties or something, but we'll have a crying party with LSD and potatoes. That'll be our thing.
I want to get to the point where I'm crying while I'm planting a potato. Like, I want that seems aspirational to me.
You're right.
You'll see the potatoes cry.
It's a biblically accurate angel. It's covered in eyes, right?
I was actually I was on shrooms planting potatoes is when I decided that that's how flamenco dancing evolved. This is totally not accurate, but I decided that flamenco dancing evolved because you plant them with your feet. Yeah, anyway, that's not true. I was going to jump in, but Bonnie, do you want to jump in first?
I think we're laughing because it's like comedy when you laugh, but there's truths in it. And I think that maybe it'd be helpful to dig out what's the truth of the potato, because what Ashley said is not trivial. And so for me, it's like, why is it so hard to think? Why do we get into these convoluted meta, self-reflective? And that's because there's a point in this community where you realize that you've been thinking with false premises all along. And when you think with these false premises, then it leads to the conclusion of the world that we actually live in, which is problematic. So the first reason why it's hard to think is because there's some kind of realization or awareness that we're thinking with false premises. So that's one thing. But one of the false premises, one of these things that Bonnie's going to say that people won't remember in a half hour, is one of the false premises is that all the miracles are in the invisible world, in the conceptual, the invisible, the psychic, the imaginal. This is just not true. The other false premises is that the physical world is finite with respect to experience, and that the imaginal, the technological metaverse is infinite. And that also is not true. And the third false premise is that thinking is decoupled from physical work and physical action. And this is a third premise that is not true. And in fact, it's a holistic experience. And so when Ashley says you get an insight when you're planting potatoes, or I heard someone on John Vervaeke's podcast the other day say, I start by giving people a hammock and sending them off into the woods to find a place to hang it. All kinds of things happen to them, like spatial relationships. What are the perfect trees? Where would I like to be? And they start to see there's places in nature that are more, all kinds of things happen. And the insight factory and the thinking factory starts to be happen, but it's not grounded in false premises. It's grounded in the actual facticity, reality, and a relationship to the world. And that is never a false premise. So I think that's, Ashley said it with her presence and being, but to me, if you want to complexify it, that's the meaning that I think she's making with her life.
Thank you. Yeah, that's actually a little bit where I was going. Think it's is the relationship between knowing and doing. And it's, I mean, maybe this is too obvious to say, but it's not like either or. It's like tending to that relationship, because that relationship can, honestly, I don't even really know how to think about it, but the way I'm thinking about it right now is that there can be a co-evolutionary relationship between knowing and doing, and there can be a de-evolutionary relationship, let's say. And so if anything, I wonder if we might think about just tending to that relationship and supporting a healthy relationship between knowing and doing. The other thing that's just coming up for me is just, the irony maybe of a community that accuses itself of overthinking is now overthinking its relationship with overthinking, or wondering whether it's overthinking. I mean, I also feel like part of the beauty of this is that, like, we don't need to decide. We don't need to figure it out. Like, and this is part of the, Jonathan, you mentioned earlier that sometimes it's like no action feels adequate to the scope of the problem. But part of what we're doing here, I think, is like enabling a million flowers to bloom. So of course, each of those individual flowers, planting a potato is going to feel so small in comparison. But that's kind of what, I don't know how else to say it other than democratizing power, democratizing even the capacity to enact a solution, right? Like, I've started to think about, Tristan does get asked a lot the question, what should we do? And the way that I've started to think about it is just to turn that question around and just say, what should I do? Because everything needs to change, in an infinity of ways, and we're all perfectly positioned. So it's really just like, what should I do here? Plant a potato. Like, my medium is media, so that is decidedly not very physical. I love to work with movement and time. But yeah, I mean, it's like, I understand why no solution seems adequate to the scope of the problem. But to me, the fact that anyone can do it is part of the solution itself.
I really like the framework of broad scale versus large scale, right? So oftentimes we're looking for a large scale solution, which we're not finding, and it's frustrating. But the thing about like you're saying, Stephanie, everybody kind of doing their thing and using the affordance of the internet to share these things across the network, we're getting these proofs of concepts. So one direction of evolution that I can see all of us making is we're sharing ideas across the internet, and that's good. I think that's a good thing. But we also need to be sharing proofs of concept from our own lives across the network. And so we're getting this kind of broad scale diffusion, right? You can also relate it to like this diffusion of innovation model, right? We're slowly diffusing these innovations, these proofs of concepts of new ways of living. And it can be planting, it could be kinds of forms of meditation, forms of community building, whatever it is, forms of mimetic mediation within a group, right? And how that works, right? It can be many different things, but we're actually sharing these proofs of concepts across the network in addition to the ideas and kind of the larger theoretical frameworks behind them.
Mm-hmm. I have a brief comment, if I could jump in. Two things. One, I think in general, there's this culture of like, we're kind of laughing at the potato because you kind of laugh at like people doing something so simple when you're known for thinking and being an intellectual. And I think we should just like break the chains of that and talk about simple things. And in some ways, I can imagine people being much more insightful and much better intellectuals if they're, like Bonnie was saying, connecting to the real world and understanding all the premises on which their intellectual thoughts arise. And then to echo what Jason said, I think the other thing is like, maybe it's not appropriate for everybody to plant a potato. Like not all actions are proven to be great. Like not every single person should be homesteading. I think to go with what Stephanie was saying, like you could also be part of the action. We could also all be part of the action by sort of vetting actions, like what are you doing? Is it appropriate for your context? Like what does that do to solve the problems we're facing? Is it replicable for others or not? And I think there's just the diversity of like the whole human experience that can come from that set of conversations.
I mean, my feeling is to agree with all of that. It's just that even after the agreement, I feel uncomfortable. So it might just be that I'm unlucky to have this perpetual discomfort. It might just be my blessing and curse in life. But I can't help but thinking that, okay, the world is dystopic. There's always bad things going on. It always has been. There was no golden age, as far as we know, when people weren't suffering. But it does feel that there's a kind of clock ticking at the moment. We don't know if there are other forms of intelligent, sentient life out there in the wider universe. There may or may not be, but it's possible that you think we do? Anyway, it's possible that we're at least precious and possibly unique. And in that context, the fact that there is at least a chance that we would seriously damage, if not destroy, our only home, and that this is happening in a time frame now of years and decades rather than centuries, it does make me a little bit impatient. I know there's a conventional wisdom in slowing down and a conventional wisdom in attending and seeing more fully and deeply into your current context and acting where you are. But there's not a part of me that wonders if conventional wisdom is so wise in this context, that there might be a case for hurrying up. There might be a need to quicken in some way. And I just don't quite know if that is the case, because that is my sense, my intuition. At the same time, as I say that, I can think of people saying, all this action is what's causing the problem, this desire to do things and change things. And, that's what got us into this trouble in the first place. And so I carry that kind of contradiction of, on the one hand, feeling this action imperative to find ideas and forms of life and practices, spiritual, ecological, domestic or otherwise, at the same time feeling that the need to get political quickly is very strong. The need to actually find power. Where is power for us? Maybe there is power in looking after your home and your community, but the kind of power we're looking at is at a different scale. So Jason, I'm curious vis-a-vis this distinction actually about different levels of scale, because clearly an individual can't affect the whole planet and 8 billion or rising number of people. But then what should we seek to affect? Like what's a reasonable ambition? Is that even the right question? That's the kind of thing that I'm wrestling with.
Well, I think large scale, for it to not do more harm than good, like taking the levers of power, some kind of revolution, it has to, in some sense, be emergent from a groundswell, from like a real populist groundswell. And I don't mean populist in terms of a right wing or left wing, more just that enough people realize that something needs to change. And the best way that I can see to do that is this kind of broad scale diffusion. I do agree that it needs to speed up, right? That's part of, so one of our recent series on Doomer Optimism on the Substack was action oriented. Like, what are you actually doing, right? Like, tell the world so that other people can get inspired and do it as well, and create these solidarity networks that can help create some kind of groundswell to create more fertile conditions for, I think, what might eventually need to be more of a large-scale change. But again, large-scale changes are very dangerous, especially from a complexity point of view, right? And so how do you kind of create the conditions and so that the large-scale changes are not violent, right? That they're just kind of, they more just require the apple tree is already there, the apple's there, you just need to pick it, type of thing.
Right. I mean, I agree. I mean, again, it's what happens after the agreement. So it's, on the one hand, large scale change is definitely dangerous and revolutions go wrong. And at the moment, though, there's also the sense of the absence of large scale changes are dangerous too, right? And so I suppose I'm curious about the kind of diffusion you're looking for. So different form of life, right? We're trying to move toward, I mean, we're in a world predominantly of cities, albeit in population terms, not in land terms. That has to change, perhaps. The very urban environment, the sort of nature of the life that we build. Population, is that part of the story? What we eat clearly is part of the story. Our money supply and how it acts is clearly part of the story. The way that our data and our behavior is harvested, the extent to which we own that is part of the story. Then what we're living for clearly is part of the story, beyond status, beyond material acquisition. And the fusion of all of that and more, and that's just a little snapshot, of course. Yeah, I'm all for it. I just is the way to do that just to do your own thing in your own place and point towards it for others and then sit back and hope for the best? I mean, is that true? I would just briefly, we can briefly answer Stephanie and then I'll ask you to go. I think what would be adequate is something that feels true. And I think my problem is that I'm not getting that sense of volition. I'm not getting that sense of, yes, in a way that I can also add, as someone, people sometimes ask for advice on these things or a sense of direction, in a way that I could feel was the right kind of level of confidence that, yes, do this. Right. So, no, I mean, just briefly, sorry, Ashley, just briefly. I mean, for what it's worth, I wrote about this. I mean, this premise of the idea of collective individuation, it's just a notion that, ultimately our job is to find our unique contribution and to help others find theirs. And so you're right. The answer has to be, it cannot be a generic, what should I do? Because that leads to lowest hanging fruit of do your recycling and talk nicely to people, which is not really adequate. What we really need to do is to find our own unique power, which has a kind of spiritual philosophical basis in the uniqueness of each individual being somehow sacred, and to actually work with that sense of uniqueness, which is always contextual, relational. Who are you with? What are your responsibilities? What are your resources? What can you do? And find an answer to that. And everyone should try and do that. And that's the answer, kind of. Sorry, Ashley, go ahead.
But Jonathan, can I just ask you, what would be an adequate answer to your question? And what would you do with the answer to that question? For yourself individually or for the liminal web? Before going to Ashley, I'm just going to offer us I actually did this yesterday for the first time. I was interviewed by the public radio station in New Zealand, and they asked me the what should we do question. And I was like, I'm going to try this out for the first time. What should I do? Let's all of us ask. And I just said, here's what I'm thinking of doing. I'm curious what I should have asked the host, actually. I don't know. He might have been a little thrown off. But anyway, where do you or Ashley?
Yes, I would just add, I think just to bring it back to the thing that I'm going to keep hammering home, the material world will also, I think, inform this, I don't know, sort of revelation. And I just was listening to our interview with Neil Spackman, who does the work of regeneration. Like he builds ecological systems that produce food for humans, like infinite more habitat. They can change the weather, he thinks. His plan is to plant 1 billion mangroves before he died, or by the end of his career. And he says regenerative systems can produce an infinite amount of good over time. They contain an infinity because they're not dependent on external outputs, but because they reconstruct the foundation on which they're built. This is a direct quote from our recent podcast with him. Just thinking about the ways in which nature can confirm these thoughts we have outside of material reality, just to bring it back to that, I think the more time we spend in, for example, I try to do some sort of regenerative homesteading on our land, like this just confirms those thoughts that I have, separate from the material world and strengthens them.
I have a chicken hutch that came with the house, like a coop, I guess. When we came to look at the house, the Wi-Fi network was Urban Gardener 505 in Santa Fe. Here, 505 is the area code. And the guy had 19 chickens and 2 goats in this backyard and was sharing goat milk and goat cheese and eggs with the whole neighborhood. And so everyone was really excited. And they're like, oh, yes, we reflect so fondly on the former homeowner, as opposed to that bastard was keeping us up with his rooster. So there's that. Jonathan, I can't let this slide. I have to tell you this story because this is a total dog leg. I'm going to drop a bomb on y'all, but I feel like it matters because in the context of the question of what should I do, it's important for everyone on this call to know I'm outing myself right now because I have already done this on Stuart Davis's Aliens and Artists podcast, that I am a UFO experiencer. Like I'm a contactee. And in 2006 and 2007, when I was completely adrift in my life, I had gotten out of college and I had no idea what I was doing with myself. And I was in love with someone, but I was being tugged in a different direction academically. And I had all these recommendation letters that I never sent to the graduate schools because I didn't want to leave this woman who is now the mother of my children. Yay. And I was stuck in this sort of ruminating loop in Lawrence, Kansas, trying to figure out what to do next for 2 years. And in that time, I was working as a scientific illustrator at the Natural History Museum, and it wasn't paying the bills because of Bush-era educational budget cuts. That was another career that could have happened that didn't. And then, so in 2006 and 2007, in the span of 8 months, I took 3 different groups of people. One was me and my wife and our friends on a double date. One was me and my buddy from high school and his college roommate. And one was me and another friend of mine from high school who I had this sort of like brother-sister relationship with, that we found each other in high school. All 3 groups of people at Clinton Lake in Lawrence, Kansas, over the span of 8 months, saw these, for lack of a better word, UFOs, but they were like transparent objects full of lights, like embedded with lights, like bioluminescent sea creatures that had all kinds of different patterns moving around in the sky. And for the record, because we've been talking about LSD potatoes, we were on mushrooms, but this is a recursivity thing. And at the time, I had been going out to this lake for years tripping mushrooms, and I had never seen anything like this. And I had gotten very, very good at being able to tell the difference between what my brain is making up versus what the world out there is. Anyway, the point is that I saw these things, and it wasn't just me seeing them. It was these other people seeing them too. And it wasn't just them seeing them too. It was that when they showed up, the animals around this lake would start to erupt in the middle of the night in noise. These were like overnight trips where like there would be a sort of a wave of UFO activity on a full moon. And then as more and more things started to appear in the skies, birds would start squawking. They were restless and uncomfortable. And I had what I believed to be kind of like a transmission or something in one of these experiences in which I was explained by whatever this intelligence was inhabiting or possibly embodied as the craft itself, that our world is rare and precious, as you said, but it's precisely because it is rare and precious that other worlds that had born life first took notice of it and came to it early in its development, and that what I was seeing were actually forms that had been embedded in the living subtle body of our planet from its inception. That the UFOs that or whatever that I was witnessing were intelligences that were basically, in some respect, more native to this planet than I am. Like they'd been around from the very beginning, watching and stewarding this. And then the last thing, and to be clear, like I am a freak because I have never been able to situate these experiences since then. I've just simply had to just digest them and make peace with them. The last experience I had was the one with my ostensible sister, who we had some weird dynamic, and I had met a woman online that she had a spiritual emergency in her midlife, and she became like a Reiki healer and said that she was like communicating telepathically with whales. And then in the midst of all of this, her family institutionalized her and separated her from her teenage son because they were concerned about her. And then when she got out, she told me that she thought that she had been my mother in a past life. And the same week, my friend told me that she thought I had been her brother in a past life, but on another planet. And both of them said the same thing. And we were like, all right, well, let's take mushrooms and go to the lake. And so my friend and I, the ostensible sister, did this. And message that we got that night was, yes, that you were, and that everybody is, that there's this sort of cosmic web of reincarnation, and that in some way makes a lot of the people on Earth aliens, actually. That like a lot of the people who are here now are actually the aliens, whereas the UFOs are actually the ones that have been here for 4 billion years. So it was like a switch flipped there. But the point was, and this is where I think I can re-embed this insane story back into this conversation, is that it was saying, don't get homesick. You were born here. You live here. You are an earthling. This is your life. And the question of what should I do was, for me, that was the question that was crippling me at the time, because for the first 22 years of my life, I knew for a fact I was going to be a vertebrate paleontologist. And when I got out of school, a number of things fell apart, and that didn't come to pass. And I was deeply, deeply confused about myself. And I had never, in my questing, in my search for an answer of how should I act, I had never gotten anything but don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. And the sense that I got coming out of that experience was very specifically that, okay, when I was 12 years old, I was living in Orlando. My father worked for amusement parks. My mother had a dream that I grew up and became a whale trainer, and that an orca breached and accidentally broke my back, like landed on me and accidentally killed me, and that this orca whale was mourning me in her dream. And she made me promise to her as a child that I would never grow up to become a whale trainer. And so like there was this subthread under paleontology of marine biology. And what I got out of that trip was, it said, you would have wasted your life looking for us, because you would have gone from being interested in the deep sea to being interested in like what else is down there, to like loving the film The Abyss, thinking about all this stuff. And The Abyss is like more or less exactly how these things manifested themselves. The aliens that appear at the end of that film are very reminiscent of what I saw. And the point was that you are supposed to be talking to people. You are supposed to be in the fray. You're supposed to be on the land with sinus pressure so that you can't ever get scuba certified, because you get a headache if you put your head more than a few feet underwater. You have these constraints that place you in the human sphere and that anchor you. And now you all know the horrible underbelly of me. But I mean, when I think about what should I do, for me, it's like I have to zoom out as far as possible and actually accept the possibility that my role and our role by extension, because I mean, we're all here, we're all implicated in this, you're my accomplices and I am yours, is that this is a moment in the history of the planet, like the advent of multicellularity, or like the emergence of complex social organisms. And it's important to get it right. And in order to get it right, we need to be thinking through these things. We need to be talking through these things. I loved what you said earlier, Jonathan, about the performativity of confusion, because that was something that was very also happening at the same time. Was I was starting to share this stuff on the then new Facebook and say, like, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm for. And those were the posts that got the most traction. That was what people appreciated the most, was an invitation into the question. So, I mean, really, I think that there are fine reasons to have answers, and there are fine times for them, and many ways that we should. But anyway, end rant. I've probably said enough now that I can stop talking for the rest of this call and just let you all play with that Pandora's box that I just opened. And thank you.
I mean, it's what you've just shared, Michael, is sort of unexpected and generous and eccentric and challenging, and incredible, not in the literal sense of not being believable, but in the sense of being extraordinary. My positive response to it is that a sort of guilty secret of mine is occasionally enjoying New Age music. And there are some New Age songs which sort of go along the lines of "Remember Who You Are," and they're a little bit similar in spirit to what you just shared. There's a kind of extraterrestrial vantage point that asks you to see yourself as part of a human species, an organism, existing on a particular planet in the far reaches of space, and that somehow you're part of all that. And so the experience that you had that made you feel that way, and by implication, if I've read you correctly, in effect, that was a very long way of saying it's good to talk, right? I think, and you were giving it some cosmic justification, some cosmic epistemic justification for the idea that what we're doing here is actually endorsed by the alien natives of the planet, which, I can be agnostic about the ontological truth of that, but I appreciate the rhetorical power of it. And I'm grateful for it, because it wasn't what I expected this afternoon. And I don't know what to make of it at some, I can't validate it in any way, but I can see that it's real for you. And I'm glad to have been here when you shared it. So thanks.
I will just pin to this that the point was that had I wasted my life in a submersible looking for evidence of alien civilizations under the seas, my job was not to prove them to anyone. It's utterly not the point. And the last time I saw them, they specifically said, "This is it. We're not going to appear for you anymore." After this, there was a fourth sighting in which I brought groups of friends together, actually later that summer. And so, yeah, I think you're right to emphasize the rhetorical over the ontological here, because that was their point as well. It was just like, look, it's not your job to prove that we exist. People are not going to believe you. The last UFO sighting, I actually did have another UFO sighting in 2017, in which my friend and I watched this thing for 45 seconds while it was over the shoulder of a third friend in the conversation. We were trying to get to turn around and he wouldn't. And he just wouldn't turn around. And there's something irreducible about that in this. And I think that maybe that's what anchors this to the deeper thing here, which is that Sean Hargens, who is my graduate, I ended up doing 1 year of graduate study under this guy Sean Esbjorn Hargens, who's a fabulous integral scholar, wrote Integral Ecology with Michael Zimmerman at CU Boulder, and has since outed himself also as a contactee. I've had him on the show to try and unpack how he understands his sort of like inactivist view of ontologically plural intelligences, that like maybe we're the alien, like we're the ghosts to ghosts and that kind of thing. And yeah, I think that there's something about it being ontologically plural that is what allows it to cohere in a kind of Buckminster Fuller tensegrity kind of way that we need to see things differently in order for this thing to function holistically as an ecosystem. Like the biospherically speaking, we should not all agree. So anyway, thank you.
I might maybe just offer some closing remarks because I might need to leave before the end of the hour. Yeah, maybe I'll just make another plug for a healthy relationship between knowing and doing. I mean, I think because, yeah, it's like, should we be knowing? Should we be doing? I think, Jonathan, the example you brought up of what Emerge is doing right now with your podcast, with people in Ukraine is amazing and beautiful, and a beautiful example of, and this is something I actually ask Tristan and Asa on your own event. I ask us to do that with the show. It's like, how can we get work done with the show? How can we treat each interview like a meeting with the person we have some work to do with, work it out. But just to go back to the what should I do? On the one hand, no answer, an infinity of answers. On the other hand, good for us for continuing to ask that question and wrestle with that question. If you wrestle with it every day, you will be going through a midlife crisis every day. And also, that is part of how we continue to wrestle with whether we should be doing the things that we are doing and whether there are things we can do more, there is more that we can do that would be of greater service. So I do say maybe no answer or maybe a million answers, and also keep asking the question. But the last thing I wanted to bring in is to bring in our dear friend Danella Meadows and her 12 leverage points for intervening in a system. So yeah, and oftentimes, I mean, and I still do this myself. It's like, don't discriminate based on where you are along the leverage scale, but like I kind of do sometimes. Like I look at the shifting paradigm and I'm like, oh yeah, it's all about that. And then look at the lower ones, it's like, eh. But the truth is, we have to play a chord. I almost think of it as a piano. We want to play a chord. And the way we know if it's working is it sounds good. It actually sounds good all together. And I do think there is a difference. It's not the difference between the lower down and the higher up, but the difference between the lower down that's not playing with everyone or the higher up that's not playing with everyone. So yeah, what should I do? Be part of the chord. Play a beautiful chord all the way up and down the scale. Go ahead, Bonnie.
No, I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was too long. But I was asking myself, why does this man want to be witnessed this way by us? Where is the energy coming from? It had a lot of spontaneous energy. So that's kind of what I was thinking about. I was drawing and thinking about what is the need for this energy to be witnessed here today. So I don't know if that sounds like annoyance. It wasn't really annoyance, but I was pulled into that kind of question. Yeah, so that was what was happening. And for me, the question of truth wasn't there. It was more of interpretation. I mean, I've had many experiences that I would be inclined to share. And so part of me was trying to map just a physical description of what was happening, on separate that from the interpretation. But what I concluded, I mean, if I had to give a statement on it, was that it's interesting, we're all walking around with these eschatologies, whether they've been manufactured by other people and given to us, or we've had extraordinary experiences, and that creates this desire for the mind to grow its own eschatology, whether that's implicit or explicit. And if I wanted to bend Michael's story onto my own experience, which is kind of a disservice to make sense out of it, I see that when I said the physical realm was not finite, it was infinite. I mean, the Native Americans also had, and Taoists, I'm a Taoist, have encounters of these kinds, and they don't see them as extraterrestrial, but as supraterrestrial, that they're emanations from the earth itself. And I think there's a huge amount of conversation and encounters. I once said we're probably moving from knowing an explanation to exploring and understanding. And I think with all the talents that humans have and all the energy we have for encounters of a third kind, I think that there's an infinite amount of revelation that's in the direction of the potato. It's an eschatology that doesn't Go ahead, Ashley. I'm done. Thank you for the time to say that.
No, it's okay. So 2 things. One, I personally think the levers of broad scale change here have to do with getting the attention of institutional power or money or resources, and sort of tipping their ear towards, like, if you want not widespread chaos, we should be talking about these things, how to be more resilient as individuals, families, communities, and this kind of thing. So that means, probably getting like foundation funding toward disseminating these ideas that could potentially be taken up in a broad scale way. But the ideas themselves are not prescriptive. They're a menu. I mean, this is what we're trying to do with our little bit of volunteer time on Doomer Optimism. It's a menu. Try this thing. And then the other thing is, I think that people underestimate the extent to which these actions can have cascading effects. So, but what I mean by that is, like, keeping chickens has changed my relationship with my children, my home, my land, and then that gives me new insights that sort of like ends up in this virtuous cycle that changes almost everything in this cascading way, and is continuing to change everything about, like, my life and my reality and how I relate to the world. So I think it's really just like starting that cascading effect, connecting with other people who are on that same virtuous cycle journey. And then there's also this cascading way in which people who are on that similar journey share insights, and then that cross-pollinates in really exciting and innovative ways. So I think some people say, like, oh yeah, it's so silly to tell people to keep chickens. But if let's say half of the households in the United States kept chickens for eggs, we could eliminate industrial egg production. Eliminate it. And we have the power to do that with that kind of broad scale change. But the idea is that I think we just have to empower people to the possibilities, show them the options, and say, like, just try it. I think a lot of times we just haven't been told that we're allowed to go ahead and try something different, and that action isn't something to be, or certain actions aren't something to be looked down upon.
Okay, and now you got me going, because we did this exercise in my school where we did totems, and we were looking at the earth. And the earth is a dissipative structure, so it needs energy, background microwave radiation, energy from the sun. But we started thinking of the earth as a turtle egg. Like a turtle egg, the mother turtle lays the egg and then they go away. And everything for that turtle is in the egg for whatever it manifests for the rest of its life, including maybe the turtles that it gives birth to. The seed is already whole. So we started thinking of the earth as a cosmic egg. Once the earth was the earth, everything, including this conversation, was already included, other than the sun. It is a dissipated structure. So now this is a remarkable way to look at this situation. There's something about the earth that's like a turtle egg. And so this notion that we can work on the earth, that the earth needs something from us, is completely ass backwards. But this switch of thinking of the earth as this cosmic egg that has been given everything at its instantiation of what it needs for even this to happen that's a real deep dive into a different kind of eschatology, including Michael's experience, which grounded or assembled or attracted, even if we want to interpret it as extraterrestrial, even including that experience. Well, now you know why the Native Americans said turtles all the way up and all the way down, and we think they were simple-minded, little, stupid people.
Oh my God, Bonnie, just quickly, I actually have turtle eggs in an incubator right now.
Of course you do.
I have turtles. Like, there's a turtle in this room. I have a breeding pair across the house. They're shaped kind of like a potato. They're long.
Potatoes too.
But they're like a potato and a chicken together.
I just want to say quickly, Bonnie, to me, that is a beautiful, like, taking of responsibility of your co-creation of reality. The stories we tell about ourselves, if we thought of the earth as a turtle egg, what would we do?
Which then brings it back to like, what is the role of sense makers? And I think for me, the role is this, it's inspiration, but the inspiration is drawn from like our experiences or our experiences ourselves interacting with other people's experiences of material reality, like the you know, the ideas that and the, you know, thoughts that come from that, and we just interrogate them critically, and it gives other people new ideas and new inspiration.
And this is why I'm going to plug, I think Ministry for the Future, Kim Stanley Robinson's book, is a masterpiece of taking responsibility for his co-creation of reality, because he's revealing the full gravity of what we're up against, like wet bulbs where people die in heat waves, eco-terrorism, all of it, and also rolling out this like red but realistic carpet. It's a red carpet. It's like and we can go in this direction. And that to me is the brilliance, is being able to hold the gravity of this moment and also, right, take responsibility for our co-creation of it, or our ability to get creative with it.
One, I don't know, a thought that's been occurring to me throughout this conversation is, you know, so there's a conversation a lot around optionality, and millennials were kind of sold this bill of goods of you have infinite optionality, and now there's a lot of kind of pulling of hair that I'm in my mid-30s and I don't have a family, and I'm chasing a career, and you know, there's a lot of discussion around this, and I think this relates to sense making and knowing and doing. And one way I think about it is, you know, we don't have infinite optionality if we actually want to be part of an evolutionary process. And so, but being part of an evolutionary process produces kind of infinite novelty, at least within our spirit, within our psychology. And so, like for me personally, you know, and there's many ways to do this. One thing I love about homesteading is it does reduce my optionality quite a bit. But it engages me in this process of discovering the turtle egg that's being hatched. You know, to really do a rough metaphor here, rough analogy. And so, you know, instead of thinking of what should we, you know, we need to make more sense. Yes, we need to make more sense, but we need to be making sense as we're embedding ourselves in local evolutionary processes that then we share these experiences around, and other people can see their own. Oh, I could plug myself into this evolutionary process and, you know, discover this, you know, this kind of infinite optionality by initially closing optionality.
Right. Yeah, well said, I think.
The limits. It's the limits.
Too deep.
Don't go
into the
too deep. Don't go
it's
into
also the etymology of the side, right? To cut away. It's this idea of creating freedom by constraining yourself.
Yeah.
It has its own depth, and I guess we're getting quite close to the end. I suppose I wanted to just say how wonderfully varied this conversation was, with everything from very sort of literally earthy substances to Wi-Fi breaking down on multiple fronts, to, you know, super terrestrial / extraterrestrial encounters, to the depth of a potato, the sort of and mushrooms too. So yeah, I mean, whatever this was, I'm kind of glad to have been part of it.
Agreed. Yeah. No, I mean, I think all of, and you're right to point out that what encompasses all of those things is, I mean, maybe the point that we're making is that these things are not to be treated separately. You know, that, I mean, I've heard that throughout this entire call. Stephanie, you're hammering on this, like the knowing doing thing, you know, and it's just like, good, thank you, you know, because it is important to understand that even knowing is a metabolic act. Cognition is something that is done not only, you know, by the glucose hungry brain, but like throughout this entire network, the way that we think with space, the way that we think with the land and non-human animal organisms, and and the tools that we use and the structures in which we shelter, and it's all, you know, it's a mistake to see any of those things, I think, as apart from any of the others, except in some sort of like, you know, partial sort of mutual information kind of way.
Everything is one, but the one is also many, right? So it's both are true.
So, listeners, have we answered your questions? Or have we just ruined your life? I don't know.
Your options are A, a potato, B, a turtle egg,
a UFO,
or C,
the flying crab,
or D,
or
all of the above.
A roosting hen.
E, none of the above and all of the above at the same time.
Jason, can you give us the last word here, sir? I'm putting it on you.
I just want to say that I appreciate being in this liminal space with all of you and feeling our way. I don't feel like this conversation was underdetermined or overdetermined. It's kind of, you know, it's kind of maybe a little underdetermined, but I kind of like that. You know, the too much legibility is kind of not good. But I think that there's a lot to take from this conversation. And so I appreciate all of you. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Agreed. This was a total treat.
Yay.
And again, thanks for being patient with my weirdo confession. Peace.
Peace.